The Highlander, Rob, having examined the address, broke the letter open without the least ceremony. I endeavoured to interrupt his proceeding. "You must satisfy me, sir," said I, "that the letter is intended for you before I can permit you to peruse it." "Make yourself quite easy, Mr. Osbaldeston," replied the mountaineer with great composure. "Remember your very humble servant, Robert Cormill, and the beautiful Diana Vernon. Remember, and doubt no longer, that the letter is for me." I remained astonished at my own stupidity. Through the whole night, the voice and even the features of this man, though imperfectly seen, haunted me with recollections to which I could now assign no exact local or personal associations. But now the light dawned on me at once. This man was Campbell himself, whom I had met upon the road to my uncle's. But what connection had he with the fair Diana Vernon, and of what use could he be to my father's affairs? Having read the letter, he said, "It's a kittle cast she has gi'n me to play, but yet it's fair play, and I winna balk her. Mr. Osbaldeston, I dwell not very far from hence. My kinsman can show you the way. Leave Mr. Owen to do the best he can in Glasgow. Do you come and see me in the glens, and it's like I may pleasure you and stead your father in his extremity. I am but a poor man, but wit's better than wealth. And, cousin," turning from me to address Mr. Jarvie, "if you dare venture sae muckle as to eat a dish of Scotch collops and a leg of red deer venison wi' me, come you with this Sassenach gentleman as far as Drimmen or Bucclivie, or the Clachan of Aberfoyle will be better than ony of them, and I'll hae somebody waiting to wise ye the gate to the place where I may be for the time. What say ye, man? There's my thumb. I'll ne'er beguile ye."
"Say nae mair, Robin, say nae mair. We'll see what may be done."
"Nae fear, said Campbell. "But I must be budging, cousin, for the air of Glasgow Tolbooth is not that hour salutary to a Highlander's constitution. Dougal, open the door." The jailer obeyed, and we all sallied forth, through the jail and into the street. "So, cousin Nichol, good night or good morning to you," said Campbell, "and forget not the Clachan of Aberfoyle." And without waiting for an answer, he sprung to the other side of the street and was lost in the darkness. The next morning I went, on his invitation, to Bailie Nichol Jarvie's, where a comfortable repast was arranged in the parlour. The bustling and benevolent magistrate had been as good as his word. I found my friend Owen at liberty. After we had eaten, I broached the subject that was so greatly on my mind. "I am now to ask your advice, Mr. Jarvie, which I have no doubt will point out the best way to act for my father's advantage and my own honour. Do you think," I said, "that this man, Campbell, will be able to serve me after a sort, and should I trust myself to this place of rendezvous which he has given me?"
"Frankly and fairly, it's worth trying,"
he replied. "Yet what service," I said, "am I likely to render my father by leaving Glasgow, which, it is probable, will be the principal scene of Rashleigh's machinations, and committing myself to the doubtful faith of a man of whom I know little, but that he fears justice, and has doubtless good reasons for doing so?"
"Ah, but ye judge Rob hardly," said the Bailie. "He was ance a weel-doing, painstaking drover, as ye would see among 10,000, but the times come hard, and Rob was venturesome, and the creditors, mair especially some great neighbours of his, grippit to his living and land, and they say his wife was turned out of the house to the hillside, and sair misguided to the boot. Well, Rob come hame, and found desolation, God pity us, where he left plenty. He looked east, west, south, north, and saw neither hold nor hope, neither bield nor shelter. Say, he e'en put the bonnet o'er his brow, belted the broadsword to his side, took to the braeside, and became an outlaw. Rob soon gathered an unca band of blue bonnets at his back, for he comes of a rough name when he's kent by his ain, and a name that's held its ain for mony a long year, baith again king and parliament, and kirk too, for aught I ken. An old and honourable name, for as sair as it has been worried and hodden down and oppressed. My mother was a MacGregor. I care now wha kens it. and the Rob had soon a gallant band.
I inquired what means of influence this Mr. Robert Campbell could possibly possess over my affairs or those of my father.
"Why, you are to understand," said Mr. Jarvie in a very subdued tone, "you are to understand that the Hielands have been keepit quiet since the year '89. That was Killiecrankie year. But how hae they been keepit quiet, think ye? By siller, Mr. Owen. By siller, Mr. Osbaldiston. King William caused Breadalbane distribute 20,000 good pounds sterling among them, and then Queen Anne, that's dead, gae the chiefs bits of pensions. Well, but there's a new world come up with this King George. I say God bless him for ane. There's neither like to be siller nor pensions gone among them. They hinna the means of maintaining the clans that eat them up. This canna stand long. There will be an outbreak for the Stuarts. There will be an outbreak. They will come down on the low country like a flood, and that will be seen and heard tell ere a 12-month gangs round."
"Yet still," I said, "I do not see how this concerns Mr. Campbell, much less my father's affairs."
"Rob can levy 500 men, sir, and therefore war should concern him as muckle as maist folk," replied the Bailie, "for it is a faculty that is far less profitable in time of peace. Then, to tell you the truth, I doubt he's been the prime agent between some of our Hieland chiefs and the gentlemen in the north of England. I doubt now, were Rashleigh himself, or some other of your cousins, they are a' tarred with the same stick, rank Jacobites and Papists. As to your father's affairs, your father and others, he bought the woods of Glendisseries, Glenkissach, Tobernakippach, and mony more besides, and your father's house has granted large bills in payment, and as the credit to Osbaldiston and Tresham was good, the Hieland gentlemen, holders of they bills, he found credit in Glasgow and Edinburgh for all or the greater part of the contents of they bills, so that if these bills are not paid, the Glasgow merchant comes on the Hieland lairds, why, he deal a bodle a cellar, and will like ill to spew up what his item are spent. They will turn desperate. 500 will rise that mighty sitting at hame, and the stopping of your father's house will hasten the outbreak that's been so long biting us."
"You think, then," said I, surprised at this singular view of the case, "that Rashleigh Osbaldiston has done this injury to my father merely to accelerate a rising in the Highlands by distressing the gentlemen to whom these bills were originally granted?"
Doubtless, but he canna bit off the paper here. Folk will misdoot him how we came by it. Na, he'll hae the stuff safe at some of their halls in the Hielands, and I dare say my cousin Rob could get at it gin he liked."
"But would he be disposed to serve us in this pinch, Mr. Jarvie?" said I. "You have described him as an agent of the Jacobite party, and deeply connected in their intrigues. Will he be disposed, for my sake, or, if you please, for the sake of justice, to make an act of restitution, which, supposing it in his power, would, according to your view of the case, materially interfere with their plans?"
"I canna precisely speak to that. The grandees among them are doubtful of Rob, and he's doubtful of them, and he's been well friended with the Argyle family, wha stand for the present model of government. If he was freed o' his hornings and captions, he would rather be on Argyle's side than he would be in Breadalbane's, for there's auld ill will between the Breadalbane family and his kin and name. The truth is that Rob is for his ain hand. He'll tak the side that suits him best. If the deal was laird, Rob would be for the tenants, and ye canna blame him, poor fella, considering his circumstances."
On consideration, the Bailie's whole information led me to believe that if the papers were in possession of this Highland adventurer, it might be possible to induce him to surrender what he could not keep with any prospect of personal advantage. I was conscious that the presence of his kinsman was likely to have considerable weight with him. I therefore cheerfully acquiesced in Mr. Jarvie's proposal that we should set out early next morning. A long day's travel took us hard by our destination, the Clachan of Aberfoyle. We were partaking of our supper in an inn there, amongst a company of Highlanders, when the landlady slipped a piece of paper into my hands. I read it, making as best concealment as I could. It was addressed, For the honoured hands of Mr. F.O., a Saxon young gentleman. These. The contents were as follows. Sir, there are night hawks abroad, so that I cannot give you and my respected kinsman, B.N.J., the meeting at the Clachan of Aberfoyle, whilk was my purpose. I pray you to avoid unnecessary communication with those you may find there, as it may give future trouble. The person who gives you this is faithful, and may be trusted, and will guide you to a place where, God willing, I may safely give you the meeting. R.M.C. I was a good deal mortified at the purport of this letter, which seemed to adjourn to a more distant place and date the service which I had hoped to receive from this man Campbell. Still, however, it was some comfort to know that he continued to be in my interest, since without him I could have no hope of recovering my father's papers. I resolved, therefore, to obey his instructions, and, observing all caution before the guests, to take the first good opportunity I could find to procure from the landlady directions how I was to obtain a meeting with this mysterious person. At that moment we heard the measured footsteps of a body of infantry on the march, and an officer, followed by 2 or 3 files of soldiers, entered the apartment. He spoke in an English accent to 3 of our companions. "You are, I suppose, Major Galbraith of the squadron of Lennox militia, and these are the 2 Highland gentlemen with whom I was appointed to meet in this place?" They assented, and invited the officer to take some refreshments, which he declined. "I have been too late, gentlemen, and am desirous to make up time. I have orders to search for and arrest 2 persons guilty of treasonable practices. Do these gentlemen belong to your party?" Looking at the bailey and me, who, engaged in eating our supper, had paid little attention on his entrance. "Travellers, sir," said Galbraith. "Lawful travellers by sea and land, as the prayer book hath it." "My instructions," said the captain, taking a light to survey us closer, "are to place under arrest an elderly and a young person. I think these gentlemen answer nearly the description. You, sir," to me, "what may your name be?" "Francis Osbaldiston, sir." "What, a son of Sir Hildebrand Osbaldiston of Northumberland?" "No, sir," interrupted the bailey. "A son of the great William Osbaldiston, of the house of Osbaldiston and Tresham, Crane Alley, London." "I'm afraid, sir," said the officer, "your name only increases the suspicions against you, and lays me under the necessity of requesting that you will give up what papers you have in charge." He commanded me to be disarmed and searched. They found nothing except the note which I had received through the hand of the landlady. "This is different from what I expected," said the officer, "but it affords us good grounds for detaining you. Here I find you in written communication with the outlawed robber, Robert MacGregor Campbell, who has been so long the plague of this district. How do you account for that?" I could not think of betraying the poor woman who had given it to me, and remained silent. "I believe," said the officer, "the best thing I can do is to send these persons to the garrison under an escort. They seem to be in immediate correspondence with the enemy, and I shall be in no respect answerable for suffering them to be at liberty. Gentlemen, you'll consider yourselves as my prisoners. As soon as dawn approaches, I will send you to a place of security." We slumbered out the remainder of the night in the best manner that the miserable accommodations of the alehouse permitted. The morning had broken when a corporal and 2 men rushed into the hut, dragging after them, in a sort of triumph, a Highlander, whom I immediately recognized as my acquaintance, the ex-turnkey. The officer, whose name I understood was Thornton, instituted a very close inquiry into Dougal's life and conversation, and compelled him to admit, though with apparent reluctance, the successive facts: that he knew Rob Roy MacGregor, that he had seen him within these 12 months, within these 6 months, within this month, within this week, in fine, that he had parted from him only an hour ago. All this detail came like drops of blood from the prisoner, and was, to all appearance, only extorted by the threat of an halter and the next tree, which Captain Thornton assured him should be his doom if he did not give direct and special information. "And now, my friend," said the captain, "let us understand each other. You have confessed yourself a spy, and should string up to the next tree. But come, if you will do me one good turn, I will do you another. You, Donald, you shall, just in the way of kindness, carry me and a small party to the place where you left your master,
as I wish to speak a few words with him on serious affairs, and I'll let you go about your business, and give you 5 guineas to boot." "And you'll ask her to gang nae further than just to show you where the MacGregor is? Ochone! Silence your howling, you rascal! Corporal, make the men fall in front of the houses. Get out these gentlemen's horses. We must carry them with us. I cannot spare any men to guard them here. Come, lads, get under arms." The soldiers bustled about and were ready to move. We were led out, along with Dougal, in the capacity of prisoners, and the whole company marched on. Our route, though leading towards the lake, was in the beginning so much shaded by wood that we only from time to time obtained a glimpse of that beautiful sheet of water. But the road now suddenly emerged from the forest ground and wound close by the loch. The corporal commanding the advance sent back one of the file who formed it to tell the captain that the path in front was occupied by Highlanders, stationed on a commanding point of particular difficulty. Almost at the same instant, a soldier from the rear came to say that they heard the sound of a bagpipe in the woods through which we had just passed. Captain Thornton, a man of conduct as well as courage, instantly resolved to force the pass in front, without waiting till he was assailed from the rear. The party advanced with the firmness of English soldiers. We approached within about 20 yards of the spot where the advanced guard had seen some appearance of an enemy, when the attack which was meditated was prevented by the unexpected apparition of a female upon the summit of a rock ahead of us. "Stand," she said, with a commanding tone, "and tell me what you seek in MacGregor's country." I have seldom seen a finer or more commanding form than this woman. She might be between the term of 40 and 50 years, and had a countenance which must once have been of a masculine cast of beauty, though now imprinted with deep lines by exposure to rough weather, and perhaps by the wasting influence of grief and passion, its features were only strong, harsh, and expressive. "It's Helen Campbell, Rob's wife," said the bailey. "What seek you here?" she asked again of Captain Thornton, who had himself advanced to reconnoitre. "We seek the outlaw, Rob Roy MacGregor Campbell," answered the officer, "and make no war on women." "Aye," retorted the Amazon, "I am no stranger to your tender mercies. Ye have left me neither name nor fame. Ye have left me and mine neither house nor hold, blanket nor bedding, cattle to feed us or flocks to clothe us. Ye have taken from us all. The very name of our ancestors have ye taken away, and now ye come for our lives." "I seek no man's life," replied the captain. "I only execute my orders. Move forward, Sergeant." "Forward! March!" said the non-commissioned officer. "Huzzah, my boys, for Rob Roy's head and a purse of gold!" He quickened his pace into a run, followed by the 6 soldiers, but as they attained the first traverse of the ascent, the flash of a dozen of firelocks from various parts of the pass parted in quick succession and deliberate aim. The sergeant was shot through the body and rolled from the face of the cliff into the deep lake, where he perished. Of the soldiers, 3 fell, slain or disabled. The others retreated on their main body, all more or less wounded. Surrounded by treble their number, and without the power either to advance or retreat, exposed to a murderous and well-aimed fire, which they had no means of returning with effect, they at length laid down their arms by the order of their officer, when he saw that protracted resistance would be only wasting the lives of his brave followers. Mr. Jarvie and I also submitted to our fate, and, with great roughness on the part of those who assisted, were dragged before Helen MacGregor. The lady was about to speak, when a few wild strains of a pibroch were heard advancing up the road from Aberfoyle. There was a marked difference betwixt the appearance of these newcomers and that of the party by which our escort had been defeated. They appeared before the wife of their chieftain in silence, and with downcast and melancholy looks. They paused when they approached her, and the pipes sent forth a wild and melancholy strain. Helen rushed towards them with a countenance in which anger was mingled with apprehension. "What means this, Alistair?" she said to the minstrel. Why a lament in the moment of victory? Robert, Hamish, where's the MacGregor? Where's your father? Her sons, who led the band, advanced with slow and irresolute steps towards her, and murmured a few words in Gaelic, at hearing which she set up a shriek that made the rocks ring again, in which all the women and boys joined, clapping their hands and yelling as if their lives had been expiring in the sound. "Taken," repeated Helen when the clamour had subsided. "Taken, captive, and you live to say so. Coward dogs, did I nurse you for this, that you should spare your blood on your father's enemies, or see him prisoner and come back to tell it?" At length, when her resentment appeared in some degree to subside, the eldest endeavoured respectfully to vindicate himself and his brother from his mother's reproaches. "The MacGregor," his son stated, "had been called out upon a trysting with a lowland hallion who came with a token from—" He muttered the name very low, but I thought it sounded like my own. "Accordingly, he went to the place of appointment," which had some wild Highland name that I cannot remember, "attended only by Angus Breck and little Rory, commanding no one to follow him. Within half an hour Angus Breck came back with the doleful tidings that the MacGregor had been surprised and made prisoner by a party of Lennox militia under Galbraith of Garshatachan." Helen MacGregor turned to me. "Your name," she said to me, "is Osbaldiston." "My name is Osbaldiston," was my answer. "Rashleigh, then, I suppose, is your Christian name," she pursued. "No, my name is Francis." "But you know Rashleigh Osbaldiston," she continued. "He is your brother, if I mistake not, at least your kinsman and near friend." "He is my kinsman," I replied, "but not my friend." "Then," she replied, "if a stranger to his intrigues, you can go in safety to Garshatachan and his party without fear of being detained, and carry them a message from the wife of the MacGregor." I answered that I knew no reasonable cause why the militia gentlemen should detain me, that I had no reason on my own account to fear being in their hands. "Be it so," she said. "I shall cause you to be guided to the enemy's outposts. Ask for their commander, and deliver him this message from me, Helen MacGregor, that if they injure a hair of MacGregor's head, and if they do not set him at liberty within the space of 12 hours, there is not a lady in the Lennox but shall, before Christmas, cry the coronach for them she will be loath to lose. There is not a farmer but shall sing well awa over a burnt barnyard and an empty byre, and there is not a laird nor heritor shall lay his head on the pillow at night with the assurance of being a live man in the morning." I was given to understand that I was to perform my journey on foot, escorted by Hamish MacGregor, the elder brother, who, with 2 followers, attended as well to show me the way as to reconnoitre the strength and position of the enemy. After walking with great rapidity about an hour, we arrived at an eminence covered with brushwood, which gave us a commanding prospect down the valley, and a full view of the post which the militia occupied. They had taken up their situation with some military skill on a rising ground in the centre of the little valley of Aberfoyle. Young MacGregor intimated to me that I was to descend to the station of the militia and execute my errand to their commander, enjoining me at the same time, with a menacing gesture, neither to inform them who had guided me to that place, nor where I had parted from my escort. Thus tutored, I descended towards the military post, and when a soldier came up, desired to be conducted to his commanding officer. I was immediately brought where a circle of officers, sitting upon the grass, seemed in attendance upon one of superior rank. Having paid to this nobleman the respect which his rank appeared to demand, I acquainted him that I had been an involuntary witness to the king's soldiers having suffered a defeat from the Highlanders at the pass of Lochard, and that the victors threatened every species of extremity to those who had fallen into their power, as well as to the Low Country in general, unless their chief, who had that morning been made prisoner, were returned to them uninjured. The Duke, for he whom I addressed was of no lower rank, listened to me with great composure,
and then replied that he should be extremely sorry to expose the unfortunate gentlemen who had been made prisoners to the cruelty of the barbarians into whose hands they had fallen, but that it was folly to suppose that he would deliver up the very author of all these disorders and offences, and so encourage his followers in their licence. "You may return to those who sent you," he proceeded, "and inform them that I shall certainly cause Rob Roy Campbell, whom they call MacGregor, to be executed by break of day as an outlaw taken in arms and deserving death by 1,000 acts of violence, that I should be most justly held unworthy of my situation and commission did I act otherwise." He then conferred with his officers. "Indeed, there be no great wisdom," the Duke said, "in remaining exposed to a night attack in this place. I therefore propose that we should retreat to the house of De Cray and that of Guard Tartan, and keep safe and sure watch and ward until morning." He gave orders accordingly. The troops prepared to move, and the prisoner was brought out, his arms belted down above the elbow, and secured to his body by a horse girth buckled tight behind him. To ensure the safe custody of the prisoner, the Duke caused him to be placed on horseback behind one of his retainers, called, as I was informed, Ewan of Briglands, one of the largest and strongest men who were present. I was directed to keep close beside them, and accommodated for the purpose with a troop horse. We travelled for a certain distance, until we arrived at a place where we also were to cross the river. The Forth is of considerable depth, and the descent to the ford was by a broken, precipitous ravine, which only permitted one horseman to descend at once. The rear and centre of our small body, halting on the bank while the front files passed down in succession, produced a considerable delay, as is usual on such occasions, and even some confusion. It was while we were thus huddled together on the bank that I heard Rob Roy whisper to the man behind whom he was placed on horseback, "Your father, Ewan, wouldna he carried an old friend to the shambles, like a calf, for all the dukes in Christendom?" Ewan returned no answer. "It's a sair thing," continued Rob, "that Ewan of Briglands, whom Roy MacGregor has helped with hand, sword, and purse, should mind a gloom from a great man mair than a friend's life." Ewan seemed sorely agitated, but was silent. We heard the Duke's voice from the opposite bank call, "Bring over the prisoner!" Ewan put his horse in motion. They passed me hastily, and, dashing forward rather precipitately, entered the water. I saw the Duke on the other side, by the waning light, engaged in commanding his people to get into order, when a sudden splash warned me that MacGregor's eloquence had prevailed on Ewan to give him freedom and a chance for life. The Duke also heard the sound, and instantly guessed its meaning. "Dog!" he exclaimed to Ewan as he landed. "Where is your prisoner?" And without waiting to hear the apology, which the terrified vassal began to falter forth, he fired a pistol at his head, whither fatally I know not, and exclaimed, "Gentlemen, disperse and pursue the villain! 100 guineas for him that secures Rob Roy!" All became an instant scene of the most lively confusion. Rob Roy, disengaged from his bonds, doubtless by Ewan slipping the buckle of his belt, had dropped off at the horse's tail, and instantly dived, passing under the belly of the troop horse, which was on his left hand. Escape, indeed, was not difficult for a swimmer so expert as the freebooter, as soon as he had eluded the first burst of pursuit. At one time he was closely pressed, and several blows were made which flashed in the water around him. MacGregor, however, contrived, when very closely pursued, to disengage himself unobserved from his plaid, and suffer it to float down the stream, where in its progress it quickly attracted general attention. Many of the horsemen were thus put upon a false scent, and several shots or stabs were averted from the party for whom they were designed. Once fairly out of view, the recovery of the prisoner became almost impossible, since in so many places the river was rendered inaccessible by the steepness of its banks, or the thickets of alders, poplars, and birch, which, overhanging its banks, prevented the approach of horsemen. The trumpets, therefore, sounded the retreat, announcing that the commanding officer, with whatsoever unwillingness, had for the present relinquished hopes of the important prize which had thus unexpectedly escaped his grasp. Hitherto I had been, as it were, a mere spectator, though far from an uninterested one, of the singular scene which had passed. But now I heard a voice suddenly exclaim, "Where is the English stranger? It was he gave Rob Roy the knife to cut the belt." I was immediately awakened to the sense of my situation. I leapt from my horse, and, turning him loose, plunged into a bush of alder trees, where, considering the advancing obscurity of the night, I thought there was little chance of my being discovered. My first idea, when the tumult began to be appeased and the clatter of the horses' feet was heard less frequently in the immediate vicinity of my hiding-place, was to seek out the Duke's quarters, when all should be quiet, and give myself up to him as a liege subject who had every right to expect protection and hospitality. With this purpose I crept out of my hiding-place and looked around me. I resolved to measure my steps back to the little inn where I had passed the preceding night, since it was only in this quarter that I could hope to learn tidings concerning Rashleigh and my father's papers, which had been the original cause of an expedition so fraught with perilous adventure. I therefore abandoned all thoughts of crossing the Forth that evening, and began to retrace my steps towards the little village of Aberfoyle. I was not long upon the road when 2 horsemen came up behind me, until one was on each side of me, and the left-hand rider, pulling up his horse, addressed me in the English tongue. "So ho, my friend! Whither so late?" "To my supper and bed at Aberfoyle," I replied. "Are the passes open?" he inquired, with the same commanding tone of voice. "I do not know," I replied. "Who are you? And what is your name?" he continued. "I really do not know, sir," said I, "why I should answer questions to an unknown stranger. As I ask you no questions respecting your name and business, you will oblige me by making no inquiries after mine." "Mr. Francis Osbaldeston," said the other rider, in a voice the tones of which thrilled through every nerve of my body, "should not whistle his favourite airs when he wishes to remain undiscovered." Diana Vernon, wrapped in a horseman's cloak, was the last speaker. "Good God!" I exclaimed, like one thunderstruck. "Can it be you, Miss Vernon, on such a spot, at such an hour, in such a lawless country, in such a masculine dress, you would say? But what would you have? The philosophy of the excellent Corporal Nym is the best, after all. Things must be as they may. Pauca verba." While she was thus speaking, I eagerly took advantage of an unusually bright gleam of moonshine to study the appearance of her companion, for it may be easily supposed that finding Miss Vernon in a place so solitary, engaged in a journey so dangerous, and under the protection of one gentleman only, were circumstances to excite every feeling of jealousy as well as surprise. The rider did not speak with the deep melody of Rashleigh's voice. His tones were more high and commanding. He was taller, moreover, as he sat on horseback, than the first-rate object of my hate and suspicion. The object of my anxiety seemed desirous to get rid of my investigation. "Diana," he said, in a tone of mingled kindness and authority, "give your cousin his property, and let us not spend time here." Miss Vernon had in the meantime taken out a small case, and leaning down from her horse towards me, she said, "You see, my dear coz, I was born to be your better angel. Rashleigh has been compelled to yield up his spoil, and had we reached this same village of Aberfoyle last night, as we purposed, I should have found some Highland sylph to have wafted to you all these representatives of commercial wealth. But there were giants and dragons in the way, and errant knights and damsels of modern times, bold though they be, must not, as of yore, run into useless danger. Do not you do so either, my sweet coz." "Diana," said her companion, "let me once more warn you that the evening waxes late, and we are still distant from our home." "I am coming, sir, I am coming. Consider," she added with a sigh, "how lately I have been subjected to control. Besides, I have not yet given my cousin the packet, and bid him farewell forever." "Yes, Frank," she said, "forever. There is a gulf between us, a gulf of absolute perdition. Where we go, you must not follow. What we do, you must not share in. Farewell. Be happy." In the attitude in which she bent from her horse, which was a Highland pony, her face, not perhaps altogether unwillingly, touched mine. She pressed my hand, while the tear that trembled in her eye found its way to my cheek instead of her own.
It was a moment never to be forgotten, inexpressibly bitter, yet mixed with a sensation of pleasure so deeply soothing and affecting as at once to unlock all the floodgates of the heart. It was but a moment, however, for instantly recovering from the feeling to which she had involuntarily given way, she intimated to her companion she was ready to attend him, and putting their horses to a brisk pace, they were soon far distant from the place where I stood. Much moved, I resumed the path on which I had been travelling, when I was suddenly hailed by a touch on the shoulder, and the deep voice of a Highlander, who, walking still faster than I, though I was proceeding at a smart pace, accosted me with,
"A braw night, Mr. Osbaldiston. We have met in the murk hour before now."
There was no mistaking the tone of MacGregor. He had escaped the pursuit of his enemies, and was in full retreat to his own wilds and to his adherents. I congratulated him on his late escape in circumstances when escape seemed impossible.
"Aye," he replied, "there is as much between the crag and the woody as there is between the cup and the lip."
He now inquired into my adventures since we entered his country, and I gave him an account of the arrival of Captain Thornton and his party, and the arrest of Bailey and myself, under pretext of our being suspicious persons, and upon his more special inquiry, I recollected the officer had mentioned that, besides my name sounding suspicious in his ears, he had orders to secure an old and young person resembling our description. This moved the outlaw's risibility.
"As man lives by bread," he said, "the buzzards have mistaken my friend the Bailey for his excellency, and you for Diana Vernon. Ho, the most egregious night howlets."
"Miss Vernon?" said I, with hesitation, and trembling for the answer. "Does she still bear that name? She passed, but now, along with a gentleman who seemed to use a style of authority."
"Aye, aye," answered Rob. "She's under lawful authority now, and full time, for she's a daft hempie, but she's a metal quine. It's a pity his excellency is a thocht eldern. The like of yoursel, or my son Hamish, would be mair sortable in point of years."
Here, then, was a complete downfall of those castles of cards which my fancy had, in despite of my reason, so often amused herself with building. Although, in truth, I had scarcely anything else to expect, since I could not suppose that Diana could be travelling in such a country, at such an hour, with any but one who had a legal title to protect her, I did not feel the blow less severely when it came. I continued my narrative as well as I could, up to the episode of my having recovered the papers of my father, though I dare not trust my voice to name the name of Diana.
"I was sure you would get them," said MacGregor. "The letter you brought me contained his excellency's pleasure to that effect, and no doubt it was my will to have aided in it. And I asked ye up into this glen on the very errand. But it's like his excellency has forgathered wi' Rashleigh sooner than I expected."
I now recollected the lights seen in the library, the agitation of the tapestry which covered the secret passage from Rashleigh's apartment, and, above all, I recollected that Diana retired, in order to write, as I then thought, the billet to which I was to have recourse in case of the last necessity. Her hours, then, were not spent in solitude, but in listening to the addresses of some desperate agent of Jacobitical treason, who was a secret resident within the mansion of her uncle. Other young women have sold themselves for gold, or suffered themselves to be seduced from their first love from vanity, but Diana had sacrificed my affections and her own to partake the fortunes of some desperate adventurer, to seek the haunts of freebooters through midnight deserts, with no better hopes of rank or fortune than the mimicry of both, which the mock court of the Stuarts and Saint-Germains had in their power to bestow. We were now within a quarter of a mile from the village, when 3 Highlanders, springing upon us with presented arms, commanded us to stand and tell our business. The single word, Gregorach, in the deep and commanding voice of my companion, was answered by a shout, or rather yell, of joyful recognition. They escorted us to the inn, where I found the bailey had already been brought, and, tired as I was, I immediately took myself to a bed and sleep. In the morning, the bailey and I resolved immediately to return to Glasgow, and Rob Roy accompanied us with some of his men along the first part of our journey. Our route lay through a dreary yet romantic country, until, after a long and toilsome walk, we emerged through a pass into the hills, and Loch Lomond opened before us. A boat waited for us in a creek beneath a huge rock, manned by 4 lusty Highland rowers, and our host took leave of us with great cordiality and even affection. We bore away from the shore, and took our course for the southwestern angle of the lake, where it gives birth to the river Leven. Rob Roy remained for some time standing on the rock from beneath which we had departed, conspicuous by his long gun, waving tartans, and the single plume in his cap. At length, as the distance increased between us, we saw him turn and go slowly up the hill. Arriving in Glasgow in the late evening, I proceeded to Mrs. Flyter's, in whose house, even at this unwonted hour, light was still burning. The door was opened by Andrew Fairservice, who, upon the first sound of my voice, set up a loud shout of joyful recognition, and, without uttering a syllable, ran upstairs towards a parlour on the 2nd floor, from the windows of which the light proceeded. Justly conceiving that he went to announce my return to the anxious Owen, I followed him upon the foot. Owen was not alone. There was another in the apartment. It was my father. The first impulse was to preserve the dignity of his usual equanimity. "Francis, I am glad to see you." The next was to embrace me tenderly. "My dear, dear son." Owen secured one of my hands and wetted it with his tears, while he joined in gratulating my return. When the tumult of our joy was over, I learnt that my father had arrived from Holland shortly after Owen had set off for Scotland. Determined and rapid in all his movements, he only stopped to provide the means of discharging the obligations incumbent on his house. By his extensive resources, with funds enlarged and credit fortified by eminent success in his continental speculation, he easily accomplished what perhaps his absence alone rendered difficult, and set out for Scotland to exact justice from Rashleigh Osbaldeston, as well as to put order to his affairs in that country. My father's arrival in full credit, and with ample means of supporting his engagements honourably, as well as benefiting his correspondence in future, was a stunning blow to Macvittie and Company, who had conceived his star set forever. Highly incensed at the usage his confidential clerk and agent had received at their hands, Mr. Osbaldeston refused every tender of apology and accommodation, and, having settled the balance of their account, announced to them that, with all its numerous contingent advantages, that leaf of their ledger was closed forever. It was now my father's intention to leave Glasgow almost immediately. Indeed, he had no motive for remaining, since the most valuable part of the papers carried off by Rashleigh had been recovered. For that portion which he had converted into cash and expended in his own or on political intrigues, there was no mode of recovering it but by a suit of law, which was forthwith commenced, and proceeded, as our law agents assured us, with all deliberate speed. On the morning when we were to depart, Andrew Fairservice bounced into my apartment like a madman, jumping up and down and singing with more vehemence than tune, "The kiln's on fire, the kiln's on fire, the kiln's on fire, she's all in a low." With some difficulty I prevailed on him to cease his confounded clamour and explain to me what the matter was. He was pleased to inform me, as if he had been bringing the finest news imaginable, that the Hielands were clean broken out, every man of them, and that Rob Roy and a' his breekless bands would be down upon Glasgow or 24 hours of the clock get round. I rose in great haste, and found my father and Owen also on foot, and in considerable alarm. Andrew's news proved but too true in the main. The great rebellion which agitated Britain in the year 1715 had already broken out. by the unfortunate Earl of Mar's setting up the standard of the Stuart family in an ill-omened hour, to the ruin of many honourable families, both in England and Scotland. The treachery of some of the Jacobite agents, Rashleigh among the rest, and the arrest of others had made George I's government acquainted with the extensive ramifications of a conspiracy long prepared, and which at last exploded prematurely, and in a part of the kingdom too distant to have any vital effect upon the country, which, however, was plunged into much confusion. We held an immediate consultation on the measures we were to adopt in this crisis, and acquiesced in my father's plan that we should instantly get the necessary passports and make the best of our way to London. We travelled in haste and in peril through Dumfriesshire and the neighbouring counties of England, and we narrowly escaped being stopped on more occasions than one, being often compelled to take circuitous routes to avoid the points where forces were assembling. The rebellion, in the meantime, had extended itself to England. My poor uncle, Sir Hildebrand, whose estate was reduced to almost nothing by his own carelessness and the expense and debauchery of his sons and household, was easily persuaded to join that unfortunate standard. Before doing so, however, he exhibited a degree of precaution of which no one could have suspected him. He made his will. By this document he devised his estates at Osbaldeston Hall and so forth to his sons successively, and their male heirs, until he came to Rashleigh, whom, on account of the turn he had lately taken in politics, he detested with all his might. He cut him off with a shilling, and settled the estate on me as his next heir. I had always been rather a favourite of the old gentleman, but it is probable that, confident in the number of gigantic youths who now armed around him, he considered the destination as likely to remain a dead letter, which he inserted chiefly to show his displeasure at Rashleigh's treachery, both public and domestic. But heaven had decreed a more speedy extinction of his numerous and healthy lineage than, most probably, he himself had reckoned on. In the very first muster of the conspirators at a place called Green Rig, Thorncliffe Osbaldeston quarrelled about precedence with a gentleman of the Northumbrian border, to the full as fierce and intractable as himself. In spite of all remonstrances, they fought it out with their rapiers, and my kinsman was killed on the spot. Percival, the sot, died also in his calling. He had a wager with another gentleman, who from his exploits in that line had acquired the formidable epithet of Brandy Swalewell, which should drink the largest cup of strong liquor when King James was proclaimed by the insurgents at Morpeth. The exploit was something enormous. I forget the exact quantity of brandy which Percy swallowed, but it occasioned a fever, of which he expired at the end of 3 days, with the word "water, water," perpetually on his tongue. Dickon broke his neck near Warrington Bridge, in an attempt to show off a foundered blood mare, which he wished to palm upon a Manchester merchant who had joined the insurgents. He pushed the animal at a 5-barred gate. She fell in the leap, and the unfortunate jockey lost his life. Wilfrid, the fool, as sometimes befalls, had the best fortune of the family. He was slain at Proud Preston in Lancashire, fighting with great bravery. John also behaved very boldly in the same engagement, and received several wounds, of which he soon died. Old Sir Hildebrand, entirely broken-hearted by these successive losses, became, by the next day's surrender, one of the unhappy prisoners, and was lodged in Newgate, where he rather ceased to exist than died of any positive struggle. It was a remarkable circumstance that my father appeared suddenly to imbibe a strong anxiety that I should act upon the will, and represent his father's house. I doubt not that the excessive dislike which he entertained against Rashleigh, now Sir Rashleigh Osbaldeston, who loudly threatened to attack his father Sir Hildebrand's will and settlement, corroborated my father's desire to maintain it. Rashleigh was not altogether a contemptible personage as an opponent. The information he had given to government was critically well timed, and his extreme plausibility, with the extent of his intelligence, and the artful manner in which he contrived to assume both merit and influence, had, to a certain extent, procured him patrons among ministers. We were already in the full tide of litigation with him on the subject of his pillaging the firm of Osbaldeston and Tresham, and judging from the progress we made in that comparatively simple lawsuit, there was a chance that this second course of litigation might be drawn out beyond the period of all our natural lives. To avert these delays as much as possible, my father gave me directions to go down to Osbaldeston Hall and take possession of it as the heir and representative of the family. I was directed to apply to the local squire, Squire Inglewood, for the copy of my uncle's will deposited with him, and take all necessary measures to secure that possession which, sages say, makes 9 points of the law. Old Justice Inglewood received me with great courtesy, and readily exhibited my uncle's will, which seemed to be without a flaw. We were tete-a-tete, and several bumpers had been quaffed by the justice's special desire, when, on a sudden, he requested me to fill a bona fide brimmer to the health of poor dear Di Vernon, the rose of the wilderness, the heath-bell of Cheviot, and the blossom that's transplanted to an infernal convent. "Is not Miss Vernon married, then?" I exclaimed in great astonishment. "I thought His Excellency—"
"Pooh, pooh! His Excellency and his Lordship's all a humbug now, you know. Mere Saint-Germain titles, Earl of Beauchamp and Ambassador Plenipotentiary from France, when the Duke Regent of Orleans scarce knew that he lived, I dare say. But you must have seen old Sir Frederick Vernon at the Hall."
"Good heavens! Miss Vernon's father?"
"To be sure he was," said the Justice coolly. "There's no use in keeping the secret now, for he must be out of the country by this time. Otherwise, no doubt, it would be my duty to apprehend him."
My head swam with the shock I had received. "I never heard," I said, "that Miss Vernon's father was living."
"It was not our government's fault that he is," replied Inglewood. "To the devil a man there is whose head would have brought more money."
"Was he then not known at Osbaldeston Hall?" I inquired.
"To none but to his daughter, the old knight, and Rashleigh, who had got at that secret, as he did at everyone else, and held it like a twisted cord about poor Di's neck."
Mr. Inglewood did not doubt. Since we had not heard of Sir Frederick being in the hands of the government, he must be by this time abroad, where, agreeable to the cruel bond he had entered into with his brother-in-law, Diana, since she had declined to select a husband out of the Osbaldeston family, must be confined to a convent. I cannot tell, such is the waywardness of the human heart, whether this intelligence gave me joy or sorrow. It seemed to me that, in the knowledge that Miss Vernon was eternally divided from me, not by marriage with another, but by seclusion in a convent, in order to fill an absurd bargain of this kind, my regret for her loss was aggravated rather than diminished. I became dull, low-spirited, absent, and unable to support the task of conversing with Justice Inglewood, who in his turn yawned and proposed to retire early. I took leave of him overnight, determining the next day, before breakfast, to ride over to Osbaldeston Hall. At the Hall, I transacted much necessary business with Mr. Wardlaw, the land steward, and detained him to dine with me. We preferred taking our repast in the library, and Mr. Wardlaw, having remained with me until the evening was somewhat advanced, at length bundled up his papers and removed himself to his own habitation, leaving me in that confused state of mind in which we can hardly say whether we desire company or solitude. I had not, however, the choice betwixt them, for I was left alone in the room, of all others most calculated to inspire me with melancholy reflections. I sat watching the flickering of the fire. "And this," said I, "is the progress and the issue of human wishes. Nursed by the merest trifles, they are first kindled by fancy, nay, are fed upon the vapour of hope, till they consume the substance which they inflame, and man and his hopes, passions, and desires sink into a worthless heap of embers and ashes." There was a deep sigh from the opposite side of the room, which seemed to reply to my reflections. I stared up in amazement. Diana Vernon stood before me, resting on the arm of a figure who could be none but her father. He was the first that spoke, for Diana kept her eyes fast fixed on the ground, and astonishment actually riveted my tongue to the roof of my mouth. "We are your supplicants, Mr. Osbaldeston," he said, "and we claim the refuge and protection of your roof till we can pursue a journey
where dungeons and death gape for me at every step. Surely, I articulated with great difficulty, Miss Vernon cannot suppose, you, sir, cannot believe that I have forgot your interference in my difficulties, or that I am capable of betraying anyone, much less you.
I know it, said Sir Frederick. Yet it is with the most inexpressible reluctance that I impose on you a confidence, disagreeable perhaps, certainly dangerous, and which I would have specially wished to have conferred on someone else. But my fate, which has chased me through a life of perils and escapes, is now pressing me hard, and I have no alternative.
Diana raised her eyes. "You now understand my mystery," she said. "You know, doubtless, how near and dear that relative is who has so often found shelter here, and will be no longer surprised that Rashleigh, having such a secret at his command, should rule me with a rod of iron."
Her father added that it was their intention to trouble me with their presence as short a time as was possible. I entreated the fugitives to waive every consideration but what affected their safety, and to rely on my utmost exertions to promote it. "Permit us now to retire," said Sir Frederick. "We must take repose when we can, since we are absolutely uncertain when we may be called upon to renew our perilous journey." He drew his daughter's arm within his, and, with a profound reverence, disappeared with her behind the tapestry. I paced the library until I had chafed myself into a temporary fever. I then threw myself on the couch and endeavoured to dispose myself to sleep, but it was in vain that I used every effort to compose myself. My blood throbbed, to my feverish apprehension, in pulsations which resembled the deep and regular strokes of a distant fulling mill, and tingled in my veins like streams of liquid fire. At length I was brought to myself by the sound of a violent knocking at the gate. I leapt from my couch in great apprehension, took my sword under my arm, and hastened to forbid the admission of anyone. When I had reached the staircase, I heard the feeble and intimidated tones of the butler expostulating with rough voices, which demanded admittance by the warrant of Justice Standish and in the King's name, and threatened the old domestic with the heaviest penal consequences if he refused instant obedience. I ran back to the library, barricaded the door as best I could, and hastened to that by which Diana and her father entered, and begged for instant admittance. Diana herself undid the door. She was ready dressed, and betrayed neither perturbation nor fear. "Danger is so familiar to us," she said, "that we are always prepared to meet it. My father is already up. He is in Rashleigh's apartment. We will escape into the garden, and thence by the postern gate into the wood. Keep them a few minutes in play. And, dear, dear Frank, once more, fare thee well." She vanished like a meteor to join her father, and the intruders were rapping violently and attempting to force the library door by the time I had returned into it. Spinning out the time as much as possible, I was at length compelled to open the door, which they would otherwise have forced. The magistrate, Mr. Jobson, entered with several assistants, and exhibited his warrant, directed not only against Frederick Vernon, an attainted traitor, but also against Diana Vernon, spinster, and Francis Osbaldeston, gentleman, accused of misprision of treason. It was a case in which resistance would have been madness. I therefore, after capitulating for a few minutes' delay, surrendered myself a prisoner. I had next the mortification to see Jobson go straight into the chamber of Miss Vernon, and I learned that from thence, without hesitation or difficulty, he went to the room where Sir Frederick had slept. "The hare has stolen away," said the brute, "but her form is warm. The greyhounds will have her by the haunches yet." A scream from the garden announced that he prophesied too truly. In the course of 5 minutes, Rashleigh entered the library with Sir Frederick Vernon and his daughter as prisoners. "The fox," he said, "knew his old earth, but he forgot it could be stopped by a careful huntsman,
I had not forgotten the garden gate, Sir Frederick, or, if that title suits you better, most noble Lord Beauchamp. Rashleigh, said Sir Frederick, thou art a detestable villain. I better deserve the name Sir Knight, or my lord, when, under the direction of an able tutor, I sought to introduce civil war into the bosom of a peaceful country. But I have done my best, he said, looking upwards, to atone for my errors. I could hold no longer. I had designed to watch their proceedings in silence, but I felt that I must speak or die. If hell, I said, has one complexion more hideous than another, it is where villainy is masked by hypocrisy. Ha! My gentle cousin, said Rashleigh, holding a candle towards me and surveying me from head to foot. Right welcome to Osbaldeston Hall. I can forgive your spleen. It is hard to lose an estate and a mistress in one night, for we shall take possession of this poor manor house in the name of the lawful heir, Sir Rashleigh Osbaldeston. Now, we will convey these persons to a more proper place of custody. I have provided the old family coach for your convenience. We were taken down and placed in the carriage with Mr. Jobson. The escort consisted of Rashleigh and several horsemen, peace officers and their assistants. So soon as we had passed the gate at the head of the avenue, the carriage was impeded in its further progress by cattle, amongst which we were involved, and by a barricade of felled trees in front. Two of the escort dismounted to remove the trees, which they might think were left there by accident or carelessness. The others began with their whips to drive the cattle from the road. "Who dare abuse our cattle?" said a rough voice. "Shoot him, Angus." Rashleigh instantly called out, "A rescue! A rescue!" and, firing a pistol, wounded the man who spoke. "Claymore!" cried the leader of the Highlanders, and a scuffle instantly commenced. The officers of the law, surprised at so sudden an attack, and not usually possessing the most desperate bravery, made but an imperfect defence, considering the superiority of their numbers. Rashleigh dismounted, and on foot maintained a desperate and single-handed conflict with the leader of the band. The window of the carriage on my side permitted me to witness it. At length Rashleigh dropped. "Will you ask forgiveness for the sake of God, King James, and old friendship?" said a voice which I knew right well. "No, never," said Rashleigh firmly. "Then, traitor, die in your treason," retorted MacGregor, and plunged his sword in his prostrate antagonist. In the next moment he was at the carriage door, handed out Miss Vernon, assisted her father and me to alight, and, dragging out the magistrate, head foremost, threw him under the wheel. "Mr. Osbaldeston," he said in a whisper, "you have nothing to fear. I must look after those who have. Your friends will soon be in safety. Farewell, and forget not the MacGregor." He whistled. His band gathered round him, and, hurrying, Diana and her father along with him, they were almost instantly lost in the glades of the forest. Sir Rashleigh Osbaldeston was still alive, but dreadfully wounded. "Cousin Francis," he said, "draw near to me." I approached him as he requested. "I wish you only to know that the pangs of death do not alter one iota of my feelings towards you. I hate you," he said, the expression of rage throwing a hideous glare into the eyes which were soon to be closed forever. "I hate you with a hatred as intense, now while I lie bleeding and dying before you, as if my foot trod on your neck." "I have given you no cause, sir," I replied, "and for your own sake I could wish your mind in a better temper." "You have given me cause," he rejoined. "In love, in ambition, in the paths of interest, you have crossed and blighted me at every turn. I was born to be the honour of my father's house. I have been its disgrace, and all owing to you. My very patrimony has become yours. Take it," he said, "and may the curse of a dying man cleave to it." In a moment after he had uttered this frightful wish, he fell back, his eyes became glazed, his limbs stiffened. but the grin and glare of mortal hatred survived even the last gasp of life. I will dwell no longer on such a painful picture, nor say any more of the death of Rashleigh than it gave me access to my rights of inheritance without further challenge, and that Jobson found himself compelled to allow that the ridiculous charge of misprision of high treason was got up on an affidavit which he made with the sole purpose of favouring Rashleigh's views and removing me from Osbaldeston Hall. I returned to London when I had put my affairs in order at Osbaldeston Hall, and felt happy to escape from a place which suggested so many painful recollections. My anxiety was now acute to learn the fate of Diana and her father. A French gentleman who came to London on commercial business was entrusted with a letter to me from Miss Vernon, which put my mind at rest respecting their safety. It gave me to understand that the opportune appearance of MacGregor and his party was not fortuitous. The Scottish nobles and gentry engaged in the insurrection, as well as those of England, were particularly anxious to further the escape of Sir Frederick Vernon, who, as an old and trusted agent of the House of Stuart, was possessed of matter enough to have ruined half Scotland. Rob Roy, of whose sagacity and courage they had known so many proofs, was the person whom they pitched upon to assist his escape, and the place of meeting was fixed at Osbaldeston Hall. When once Sir Frederick and his daughter were again at large, they found horses prepared for them, and by MacGregor's knowledge of the country, for every part of Scotland and of the north of England was familiar to him, were conducted to the western sea-coast, and safely embarked for France. The same gentleman told me that Sir Frederick was not expected to survive for many months a lingering disease, the consequence of late hardships and privations. His daughter was placed in a convent, and although it was her father's wish she should take the veil, he was understood to refer the matter entirely to her own inclinations. When this news reached me, I frankly told the state of my affections to my father, who was not a little startled at the idea of my marrying a Roman Catholic, but he was very desirous to see me settled in life, as he called it, and he was sensible that, in joining him with heart and hand in his commercial labours, I had sacrificed my own inclinations. After a brief hesitation, and several questions asked and answered to his satisfaction, he broke out with, "I little thought a son of mine should have been lord of Osbaldeston Manor, and far less that he should go to a French convent for a spouse. But so dutiful a daughter cannot but prove a good wife. You have worked at the desk to please me, Frank. It is but fair you should wive to please yourself." How I sped in my wooing, I need not tell. You know, too, how long and happily I lived with Diana. You know how I lamented her. But you do not, cannot know, how much she deserved her husband's sorrow. I have no more of romantic adventure to tell, nor indeed anything to communicate further. I often visited Scotland, but never again saw the bold Highlander who had such an influence on the early events of my life. I learned, however, from time to time, that he continued to maintain his ground among the mountains of Loch Lomond, in despite of his powerful enemies. It seemed impossible that his life should have concluded without a violent end. Nevertheless, he died in old age, and by a peaceful death, sometime about the year 1733, and is still remembered in his country as the Robin Hood of Scotland, the dread of the wealthy, but the friend of the poor, and possessed of many qualities, both of head and heart, which would have graced a less equivocal profession than that to which his fate condemned him. Old Bailey Jarvie used to say that there were many things our bad for blessing, and our good for banning. Like Rob Roy.